Trump just made a power play in the Arctic that backfired in the most spectacular way possible. While Washington appointed a special envoy with explicit orders to acquire Greenland, Canada quietly positioned itself as the Arctic's most trusted partner. Everyone expected diplomatic silence from Ottawa. Political analysts assumed Canada would stay neutral on Trump's territorial ambitions. Strategic experts figured they'd avoid confrontation with Washington. They were completely wrong. December 2025 and the Arctic just became the hottest geopolitical battleground on the planet. Trump didn't just express casual interest in Greenland this time, he made it official. Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry gets appointed as special envoy to Greenland with one crystal clear mandate: make Greenland part of the United States. Not strengthen ties, not explore partnerships, make it American territory. That's 19th century colonial language dressed up in 21st century rhetoric. And it landed like a diplomatic bomb across the Arctic. Think about what Trump just targeted. Greenland sits on 836,000 square miles of territory, larger than Mexico, population of only 56,000 people. But that's not what matters here. This island controls the sea lanes between North America and Europe. It's sitting on massive rare earth mineral deposits that could supply a quarter of future global demand. Reports suggest Greenland holds around 5 million tons of critical minerals like neodymium and dysprosium, the exact materials needed for everything from electric vehicles to defense technology. Climate change is melting the ice sheets, opening up new Arctic shipping routes that could cut travel time between Asia and Europe by weeks. Greenland just became the most strategically valuable piece of real estate in the Northern Hemisphere, and Trump wants it. Landry tried walking it back later, claiming America isn't trying to conquer anybody or take over anybody's country. But here's what matters in diplomacy: the words you said first. And those first words were about acquisition, annexation, making Greenland American. When you appoint a special envoy specifically to bring territory into your nation, you're not talking partnership. You're talking territorial expansion. Denmark got the message immediately. Greenland got it too, and so did every other Arctic nation watching this unfold. Canada's response came fast, but not loud. December 24th, Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand picked up the phone. Direct call to Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen. The message Canada delivered. Canada supports the fundamental importance of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Parse that language carefully. Fundamental importance isn't polite diplomatic courtesy. That's establishing first principles. Sovereignty and territorial integrity isn't abstract philosophy. That's direct rejection of annexation logic. Canada just told Denmark, "We stand with you. We recognize Greenland's right to self-governance. And we're saying this publicly while Trump's envoy is actively pushing acquisition." But Anand didn't stop at words. She announced concrete action. Early 2026, Canada opens a consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, not exploring possibilities, not considering options. Opening, committed, funded, happening. That's diplomatic infrastructure. That's Canada putting actual personnel, resources, and institutional presence into Greenland precisely when Washington is talking about taking it over. The contrast couldn't be sharper. Trump sends a governor with acquisition orders. Canada sends sovereignty commitments backed by a permanent diplomatic presence. This isn't about one island. This is about the fundamental question reshaping Arctic geopolitics. How does power actually work when climate change is rewriting the rules of Northern strategy? The old model was simple: might makes right. Great powers assert territorial claims. Smaller populations get absorbed into larger empires. Strategic resources justify whatever moves you need to make. That's how empires operated for centuries, and Trump's playing from that exact playbook. But there's a new model emerging, and Canada's betting everything on it. Sovereignty partnerships, respect for self-determination even when territories are small and vulnerable, institutional cooperation through frameworks like the Arctic Council and NATO, building influence through reliability instead of coercion. It sounds idealistic until you realize it's actually more effective for middle powers like Canada. We can't outspend the Pentagon's military budget. We can't match American force projection, but we can be the partner that Arctic nations actually trust. And right now, that matters more than aircraft carriers. Greenland's reaction to Trump's move came immediately. Prime Minister Muda Goid stated clearly, Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland. Our future is not for sale and cannot simply be taken. Jens Frederik Nielsen, Greenland's Minister for Foreign Affairs, reinforced the message. Greenland belongs to its people, and we decide our own future. These aren't ambiguous diplomatic statements. They're flat rejections of American territorial ambitions. Denmark backed them up instantly. The Danish government summoned the U.S. ambassador for an explanation. Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen warned that territorial integrity must be respected. Denmark's defense minister announced increased military spending in Greenland shortly after Trump's comments. Here's what makes Canada's positioning brilliant. While Trump's envoy talks acquisition and triggers rejection from both Greenland and Denmark, Canada's opening a consulate and affirming sovereignty. Which approach do you think Greenland's 56,000 residents prefer? Which strategy builds lasting influence in Arctic politics? Which method strengthens partnerships as climate change makes northern resources and shipping routes increasingly valuable? The answers are obvious, and Canada's acting on them. Arctic shipping routes are transforming global trade right now. Melting ice is opening pathways that could revolutionize how goods move between continents. Research projects that by Arctic navigability will increase so dramatically that new trade routes and international waters become viable, cutting shipping times and fuel costs substantially. These aren't hypothetical future scenarios anymore. They're happening. Commercial interest in Arctic navigation is intensifying every year as ice coverage declines. That makes Greenland's geographic position between major continents incredibly valuable for controlling access to these emerging routes. And the mineral situation is even more critical. Greenland's rare earth deposits could meet at least a quarter of future global demand for elements essential to green technology and defense systems. China currently dominates rare earth processing, giving Beijing enormous leverage over Western supply chains. Greenland represents a potential alternative source, which is exactly why multiple nations are paying attention. Mining companies are actively exploring opportunities there. The Tan Breeze project could become one of the world's 10 largest rare earth deposits. Amarok Minerals announced discoveries of high-quality rare earths in southern Greenland, plus commercial levels of germanium and gallium at their western Greenland site. These aren't distant possibilities. These are active developments happening right now. But here's the challenge. Greenland faces severe logistical hurdles. Only 2 active mines currently operate on the entire island. No roads connect communities. Permafrost terrain makes construction incredibly difficult. The economy depends heavily on Danish subsidies and fishing. Labor shortages limit industrial development. Arctic operating costs are extreme. Large-scale rare earth extraction probably won't happen before the 2030s due to environmental concerns, financing challenges, and infrastructure gaps. It's going to take 15 to 20 years before companies see substantial profits from Greenland mining operations, even under optimal circumstances. That's exactly why partnerships matter more than ownership. Trump can appoint all the special envoys he wants, but forced annexation doesn't solve Greenland's development challenges. It would trigger massive diplomatic backlash, undermine NATO solidarity, and probably make resource development harder, not easier, by destabilizing the political environment. Canada's approach backing sovereignty while building institutional relationships actually helps create the stable framework that makes long-term development possible. You can't successfully extract resources from territory whose people fundamentally oppose your presence. Earlier in December, before Trump's Greenland envoy appointment, Anne made another significant statement. She argued that NATO needs to focus more on securing the Arctic. Canada, she pointed out, did its part helping secure Europe in past decades. Now the alliance needs to prioritize northern defense. That's not random timing, that's strategic coherence. Canada is simultaneously affirming Greenland's sovereignty against U.S. annexation talk, calling for increased NATO Arctic focus, opening diplomatic infrastructure in Nuuk, and positioning Denmark as a major partner through both Arctic Council and NATO frameworks. See the pattern. Canada isn't just reacting to Trump's latest statement. Canada's building an alternative Arctic architecture based on partnership, institutional cooperation, and multilateral defense alliances. The Arctic Council becomes particularly significant in this context. That's the multilateral forum where Arctic nations discuss regional cooperation. Members include Canada, Denmark, including Greenland and the Faroe Islands, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the United States. When Trump talks about annexing Greenland, he's not just threatening Danish sovereignty, he's undermining the fundamental premise that allows Arctic Council cooperation to function, that northern nations can address shared challenges through institutional dialogue rather than territorial competition. If the Arctic's largest military power starts pursuing 19th century land grabs, the entire framework collapses. Canada's sovereignty commitments to Greenland, therefore, aren't just about one territory. They're about defending the multilateral system that allows Arctic cooperation to work at all. That matters enormously for Canadian interests because Canada's Arctic sovereignty depends on international recognition of territorial integrity principles. If annexation talk becomes normalized, Canadian claims become vulnerable to challenge. If sovereignty partnerships prevail, Canadian security strengthens through established precedent. Think about Canada's Arctic vulnerabilities. We've got massive northern territories with small populations, resource-rich regions that become more accessible as climate change continues, shipping routes through Canadian Arctic waters that other nations might want to claim as international passages. If the international community accepts that powerful nations can just take territory from weaker neighbors when strategic interests align, Canada's got serious problems. But if the international system reinforces that sovereignty gets respected regardless of military power imbalances, Canada's position becomes much more secure. That's why a non-statement about sovereignty and territorial integrity matters so much. She's not just defending Greenland. She's defending the principle that will protect Canadian Arctic territories when pressure comes from other directions. When Canada opens a consulate in Newark, we're not just building Denmark relationships. We're establishing Canadian presence throughout the Arctic archipelago that sits between our territories and demonstrating commitment to the region independent of American decisions. When Ottawa calls for increased NATO Arctic focus, we're ensuring that Canadian security interests get multilateral support when challenges emerge. This is long-term strategic planning. This is Canada transitioning from relying primarily on American security guarantees to building resilience through diversified partnerships and institutional engagement. And Trump's Greenland play just accelerated that transition by demonstrating exactly why Canada needs alternative Arctic relationships. Denmark's response showed this clearly. After Trump named Landry as special envoy, Copenhagen didn't just protest, they acted, summoning the U.S. ambassador, publicly rejecting annexation talk, announcing increased defense spending in Greenland, coordinating closely with Canadian officials. Denmark is a NATO ally of the United States, but they're not accepting threats to their territorial integrity, even from alliance partners. That diplomatic spine matters because it shows other nations that resisting great power coercion is possible, and Greenland itself has been remarkably clear. This isn't a population expressing any interest in American governance. Polls show Greenland residents want greater independence, but from Denmark, not integration into the United States. They want self-determination, which is exactly what Canada's sovereignty message supports. When Trump talks about acquiring Greenland one way or another, he's signaling willingness to ignore what Greenland's people actually want. When Canada affirms territorial integrity, we're signaling respect for Greenland's right to decide its own future. The timing of Canada's consulate announcement is particularly significant. This was already in development before Trump's latest Greenland push, but announcing it now sends an unmistakable message. Canada's Arctic engagement is expanding regardless of American actions. We're building institutional infrastructure for long-term presence. We're investing in relationships throughout the region, and we're doing it based on partnership principles, not territorial ambitions. Compare that to Trump's approach. He wants Greenland for national security and even international security, claiming we need it and we're going to get it one way or the other. That language treats Greenland as an asset to acquire rather than a partner to respect. It's purely transactional, focused on American interests without regard for what Greenland's people want. Vice President J.D. Vance visited Greenland earlier, claiming, "A lot of other countries pose threats to Greenland and its waterways." The message: America needs to control Greenland to protect it. That's classic colonial logic. We must take your territory for your own good. Canada's message is fundamentally different. We support your sovereignty. We respect your right to self-governance. We want partnership based on mutual interest, not control based on strategic calculation. Which message do you think resonates better with populations who've experienced colonialism? Which approach builds trust with nations concerned about great power coercion? Which strategy creates lasting influence in regions where demographics and geography favor smaller populations? The economic dimensions matter too. Trump talks about Greenland's resources as though they belong to whoever controls the territory, but resource development requires cooperation from local populations. It requires stable governance frameworks that protect investments over decades. It requires environmental standards that communities accept. Forced annexation undermines all of that. It creates political instability, international sanctions, and local resistance that makes resource extraction far more difficult. Canada's approach, supporting sovereignty while building institutional relationships, creates the stable framework that actually enables resource development. Canadian mining companies are already exploring Arctic opportunities in partnership with local governments. That's how you build projects that last through agreements that benefit local populations and respect their decision-making authority. Colonialism might grab resources quickly, but partnership extracts them sustainably. The climate change dimension makes this even more critical. Arctic warming is accelerating faster than global averages. Greenland is experiencing some of the most rapid temperature increases on Earth. Ice sheets are melting, opening new shipping lanes and resource access. But that same melting is creating environmental challenges that require careful management. Who's better positioned to handle those challenges? A distant power that annexed territory against local wishes, or partnerships between local governments, Arctic nations, and international institutions? Canada's betting on partnerships, and the evidence suggests that bet makes sense. The Arctic Council has successfully managed regional cooperation for decades, specifically because it respects sovereignty rather than imposing hierarchies. NATO's Arctic security framework works because it's based on alliance commitments, not territorial control. The international laws governing Arctic shipping and resources function because nations voluntarily participate in agreed frameworks. Trump's annexation talk threatens all of that by reintroducing territorial coercion as acceptable practice. And here's what makes Canada's positioning genuinely strategic rather than just moralistic. We can't match American military power in the Arctic. We can't compete with Russian force projection either. But we can be the nation that other Arctic states trust to respect their sovereignty and work through institutional frameworks that creates influence that military might can't replicate. When Arctic nations need a partner they can rely on, Canada wants to be the obvious choice. When multilateral decisions get made about shipping rules, resource governance, or security frameworks, Canada wants a seat at the table based on our reputation for principled consistency. Trump's Greenland envoy appointment was meant to demonstrate American strength and strategic vision. Instead, it revealed isolation and diplomatic tone deafness. Greenland rejected the approach. Denmark pushed back firmly. Canada offered an alternative model that garnered respect. Other Arctic nations watched and drew conclusions about which partnerships actually serve their interests. The nation appointing acquisition envoys is losing influence. The nation opening consulates and affirming sovereignty is gaining it. This is the fundamental lesson of 21st century geopolitics that Trump keeps missing. Military and economic power matter, obviously, but in an interconnected world with established international institutions and globalized communication, legitimacy matters too. You can't just take territory from allies and expect the international system to accept it. You can't ignore what populations want and expect stable governance. You can't undermine multilateral frameworks and expect other nations to keep cooperating with you. Canada understands this because we've built our entire foreign policy around it. We're not strong enough to impose outcomes through force. So we built influence through institutional engagement and principled positions. That approach works better for middle powers And increasingly, it works better for everyone in regions where cooperation matters more than domination. The Arctic is exactly that kind of region. Resource development requires partnerships. Shipping route governance needs multilateral frameworks. Environmental protection demands cooperation. Security challenges require alliance coordination. None of that works if great powers start grabbing territory. That's why Anin's sovereignty statement resonates across the Arctic. It's not just defending Greenland, it's defending the system that makes Arctic cooperation possible. It's standing up for principles that protect all Arctic nations, including Canada. And it's demonstrating that middle powers can lead effectively when great powers abandon principle for short-term strategic grabs. The consulate opening in Nuuk represents more than symbolic commitment. It's institutional infrastructure that will enable ongoing Canadian engagement with Greenland for decades. Diplomatic presence creates relationships that outlast individual political leaders. It provides channels for cooperation on shared challenges. It demonstrates long-term commitment that builds trust. When Greenland needs partners for resource development, environmental protection, or security cooperation, Canada will have established presence and relationships. That's how you build influence that lasts. Meanwhile, Trump's special envoy approach creates exactly the opposite dynamic. It signals that American interest in Greenland is purely extractive and opportunistic. It suggests Washington views Arctic relationships through a transactional lens focused on what America can take. It demonstrates that U.S. engagement depends on short-term political calculations rather than long-term partnership commitments. Which approach do you think Arctic nations prefer? The broader implications extend far beyond Greenland. If Trump succeeds in normalizing annexation talk for strategic territories, what prevents similar logic from applying elsewhere? If controlling Arctic shipping routes justifies taking Greenland, does controlling Pacific trade justify territorial moves in Asia? If resource security validates forced acquisition, which resource-awry regions become targets? The precedent matters enormously, which is exactly why Canada's sovereignty stance is so significant. By firmly rejecting territorial coercion as acceptable practice, Canada is defending the international order that protects smaller nations from predatory great powers. That order isn't perfect, obviously, but it's far better than returning to an era where military might alone determines territorial control. Canada benefits from that order. So does Denmark. So does Greenland. So do most nations that aren't global military superpowers. Defending it serves both Canadian interests and broader international stability. And the defense works. Trump's Greenland fantasy is collapsing under diplomatic reality. Greenland won't accept American governance. Denmark won't cede sovereignty. NATO allies are pushing back. Canada's offering an alternative model. International opinion opposes forced annexation. The actual residents of Greenland have made their position crystal clear. Trump can appoint all the special envoys he wants, but he can't change those fundamental facts. What he can do is damage American credibility and influence in the Arctic. Every day, Landry serves as acquisition envoy while Greenland rejects the premise American diplomatic standing erodus. Every statement about taking territory one way or another drives Arctic nations toward alternative partnerships. Every ignored protest from Denmark undermines NATO's solidarity. Trump thinks he's demonstrating strength. He's actually demonstrating why Arctic nations need relationships that aren't dependent on Washington. Canada's capitalizing on that dynamic without overtly confronting the United States. We're not calling out American overreach directly. We're simply affirming sovereignty principles, building institutional relationships, and creating alternative frameworks. That's smart diplomacy. It achieves Canadian objectives without forcing confrontation that would damage other aspects of Canada-US relations. It builds Arctic influence while maintaining flexibility on issues where American cooperation matters. The Arctic's importance will only increase in coming decades. Climate change continues accelerating. Shipping routes become more viable. Resource deposits become more accessible. Great power competition intensifies. Geography that was peripheral becomes central. and the rules established now about how Arctic sovereignty gets respected will determine whether the region develops through cooperation or conflict. Canada's fighting to ensure its cooperation because if territorial coercion becomes normal, we're vulnerable. If sovereignty partnerships prevail, we're secure. The choice is that stark. And Trump's Greenland play clarified it perfectly. That's why AN's response wasn't just diplomatic courtesy, it was strategic necessity. Real Arctic influence comes from being the partner that northern nations trust, not the power they fear. Right now, as Trump appoints acquisition envoys while Canada opens consulates, as Washington talks annexation, while Ottawa affirms sovereignty, as American credibility collapses while Canadian influence grows, the answer to which nation is building that trust is crystal clear, and it's reshaping Arctic geopolitics while Trump's Greenland fantasy dies under the weight of diplomatic reality.